let's talk about the secret to job interviews. How many of you would like to get a job? Oh, we don't necessarily like to get a job, but we know we have to, right? Okay, so let's talk about how the whole job interview thing goes down. First of all, from the company's perspective, what's the goal of financial management?
Maximize shareholder wealth.
Yeah, maximize shareholder wealth. So when I'm sitting across from you, but my question as an employer is, are they going to make me more money than they're going to cost me? You see how that works? Are you going to make me more money than you're going to cost me? So it's all about you convincing the employer that you're going to make them more money than it's going to cost them to pay you. Now, sometimes students get confused and they think that a job interview is about sharing their hopes, dreams, and aspirations to the employer. For example, when I'm working for Halliburton, I'm maybe a year or two out, I went back to interview for the management program I was in. And there was a guy I'd actually been in undergrad with. He was getting a master's degree. Oh, for shame, she's late. He was getting a master's degree, and he comes in and he sits down, and we're kind of catching up. And then he says, does Halliburton have any opportunities in Africa? I said, yeah. I said, in fact, we've got one of the guys from the program in Nigeria right now. I said, we've also got people in Angola. I said, and by the way, this guy looks like me, right? He's just lily white. Anyway, so I said, why are you interested in going to Africa? And he said, because I want to be a missionary. I said, wow, that's great. Now, here's the question. Is Halliburton going to hire this guy and send him to Africa so he can live out his dream of being a missionary? No. I want to send him to Africa to maximize shareholder wealth. Do you think he got invited for round 2? No. If you've got these ulterior motives, it's fine. It's lovely. Just don't bring him up in the interview, right? If you want to go work in Africa and do a good job and maximize shareholder wealth, and oh, by the way, on your weekends, you're down in the village helping build whatever, great. But that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to maximize shareholder wealth. The second thing you need to recognize about interviews is that they're a two-way street. Too often students think this is all about the company finding out about me, but you also need to be finding out about the company, because I'm going to share a terrible realization with you, and that is not every company is for every person, and not every person is for every company. Example, I started out working, I've had a bunch of jobs, but every job I had, all the way through Halliburton, they loved me and thought I was freaking great. And as a result, I thought I was freaking great, right? And then I go to work for these people, and suddenly I figure out that not everybody loves me. Suddenly I figure out that I am not every company is for me, good for me, and I'm not good for every company. And so it's one of the things that you want to try to learn during the interview process. For example, I was interviewing for a job, and the guy told me, he says, everybody deserves one mistake, but after that, you're out. I said, okay. And then they made me a job offer, and I turned it down. And the guy calls me. He's like, I can't believe you turned down our job offer. And he says, was the money not enough? I said, no, the money was great. He said, why did you turn us down? I said, because I've got more than one mistake left in me, and I don't want to have to look for another job that quickly. So it's a two-way street. And the other thing to keep in mind is you need to have your asshole radar on. So I'm sitting in an interview and I'm talking to this guy, and he and I had a shared background in nuclear power. And so we're talking about that, and of course his nuclear power was better experience than mine, and blah, blah, blah. And I could tell the guy's a flaming asshole. And I'm sitting there the whole time thinking, this guy is a flaming asshole. But he is 2 levels above my boss in the organization. There's no way he's going to cause me any grief. Wrong. Turns out the guy had had my job 3 jobs ago. And so anything that I did, if I didn't do it exactly the way he would have done it, he was going to be disappointed in me. And he only had an associate's degree. I had a bachelor's degree. He had a chip on his shoulder. There's all sorts of negativity there. So always have that a-hole radar on, and if you get the signal, trust your gut, walk away. There are worse things than being unemployed, and one of them is finding yourself immersed in a nest of assholes. Then the final thing, and this one is so simple, but so many people miss out on it. At the end of the interview, if you're interested, give them a firm handshake, look them in the eye, and tell them you want the job. Isn't that a simple thing to do? It was so funny. I was 2 years into being at work at Halliburton, and the first Halliburton person to ever interview me, and I found ourselves in a bar in Houma, Louisiana, and we're sitting there, and he said, you know, when I talked to you at Arkansas, I thought you were a dead fish. He said, in the last 5 minutes of the interview, you kind of warmed up. He said, but if it hadn't have been for the fact that you turned around and said, I really want to work for Halliburton, he said, you wouldn't have made it to the next round. And so be sure to firm handshake, look them in the eye. Don't hurt them, that's not right. But look them in the eye. By the way, how is Generation Z at eye contact? Pretty bad, why? Right? And I shudder to think what's going to happen to the human race because you all have lost the ability to flirt. Right? Okay, but this handshake, eye contact, but you can make too much eye contact. My professor, my dissertation advisor, we're sitting in his office, and he said, you make an unnerving amount of eye contact. And it hadn't occurred to me. I said, if you blink in the meeting with all the other, I said, by the way, these meetings in corporate America are awash with testosterone, regardless of whether the women are involved, right? Because it's still, I said, if you didn't make eye contact, it was a sign of weakness. He said, oh. He said, do you think you can break that habit for me? I said, yes, I think I can. Okay, that's a lot of stuff about interviews, but the interview is where you shine. By the way, nowadays, you guys are applying online, and your first interview is usually with a flippin' robot, right? You've got to find some way, use your network, use the Career Center here. You've got to find some way to break through that, or you're not going to have good luck. Questions about interviews? Okay, let's talk about diversification. Last time we said that the equally weighted standard deviation for our portfolio, or not equally weighted, the value weighted standard deviation for our portfolio was 18.71%. But we said when we use the formula, it only comes out to 14.95%. That reduction in risk is known as the diversification benefit. If you have any correlation less than 1, then you can reduce the risk in your portfolio by adding that thing to your portfolio. So all I've got to do is look at, here are the returns of my portfolio, here are the returns of this new thing I'm thinking about adding. If the correlation between those things isn't exactly 1, we can get diversification benefit by adding that thing to our portfolio. And we've already talked about that. So let's talk about a real world example of diversification benefit. These stocks all have one thing in common. They are part of the S&P 500, the S&P 500. If you just had to guess, how many stocks are in the S&P 500? 500, he's on fire. Okay, so we've got and let's look at these standard deviations for all these stocks. Let's start with the S&P 500 index. The standard deviation is 15.89%. So that's our benchmark. Now, let's look at the percentage standard deviation for all of these other things. What about McDonald's? 17.74. Is that higher or lower than the index? Higher. Pfizer at 19.57. Higher or lower than the index? Higher. Walt Disney, 21.79. Higher. General Electric, 24.22. Higher. Home Depot, 26.95. Higher. So are you starting to get the pattern here? By the way, this slide is so old it still has JCPenney on it. What happened to JCPenney? Right? It's the same idea though. I'm pretty sure they figured out some other company to stick in there to replace JCPenney. So we still have it S&P 500, not an S&P 499. Okay, so what am I getting around to telling you here? This is something amazing to write down for an exam question. Something amazing to write down. It is entirely possible. It is entirely possible. It is entirely possible to have a portfolio standard deviation, to have a portfolio standard deviation, to have a portfolio standard deviation that is lower, that is lower, that is lower than the standard deviation of every single asset in the portfolio. Then the standard deviation of every single asset in the portfolio. It's lower than the standard deviation of every single asset in the portfolio. And the reason that's possible is because of this diversification benefit. Now, am I saying that every stock in the S&P 500 has a higher standard deviation than the index? No. It's entirely possible that there's one that's lower than that. But mathematically, you can have this sort of situation where the portfolio standard deviation is lower than every single asset in there. And that's just the magic of diversification. Questions?
Is it possible to have the opposite, where the portfolio's standard deviation is higher?
No, absolutely not. If I have they're all perfectly positively correlated, then all we're going to have is the weighted average of the standard deviations in there. And so it's going to end up being somewhere between the top standard deviation and the bottom standard deviation, because it's somewhere there in the middle. But when we have that correlation less than 1, then we start to get rid of some of that risk. And you could actually come in below the bottom one, but you'll never come in above the top one. Other questions? Okay. That's it for that first set of slides. Now we are on to CAPM, or the Capital Asset Pricing Model. Capital Asset Pricing Model. If you want to sound like one of the cool kids, you'll call it CAPM. If you want to sound like a nerd, you'll say CAPM, and then people will make fun of you, so don't do that. Okay, so the Capital Asset Pricing Model, we're going to walk into it very slowly. We're going to start with 2 assets. And the 2 assets are things you're already familiar with. They are Slowpoke and SuperTech. And if you remember, Slowpoke had an expected return of 10% and a standard deviation of returns of 10.5%. And then we had SuperTech, which had an expected return of 15% and a standard deviation of returns of around 24.2%. And so those are the 2 red dots, SuperTech and Slowpoke. Now I want you to take a look at this box. Do you guys see the box, the little square? What is the expected return for the little square? 13%. And what is the standard deviation for the little square? Yeah, so the thing says 14.93. Here's what I want to tell you. There is a typo on that. It should be 14.95. 14.95. So scratch through that 0.93 and put 0.95. Now I'm going to ask you this. Those numbers should be familiar to you. What did we talk about that had an expected return of 13% and a standard deviation of returns of 14.95%? Yeah, the portfolio, and I think it was, what, 60% SuperTech and 40% Slowpoke or something like that. So that box represents a single portfolio that is possible from combining these two assets. By the way, the portfolio weights always have to add up to how much? 100%. Okay. So as long as we're going to add up to 100%, we can make any portfolio we like between Slowpoke and SuperTech. Now, here's a fun exercise. I want you to draw a straight line between Slowpoke and SuperTech. I want you to draw a straight line, straight as you can, straight line between Slowpoke and SuperTech. Mr. Letterman says it is impossible to draw a straight line.
Yes.
Okay, so if you draw a straight line from Slowpoke to SuperTech, something you're going to notice is that the box is above that line. The box is above that line. Now, if these things were perfectly positively correlated, that box would be directly on the line between Slowpoke and SuperTech. And so we're already starting to see some evidence. Question, ladies? Oh, she printed slides for a friend. Okay. So we're already starting to see the graphical benefits of diversification here. And something else that we can see is that if we went ahead and figured out every possible combination of SuperTech and Slowpoke, we could plot them on this line, in the big curved line there. So you notice there's a straight line between Slowpoke and SuperTech. That's what things would be like if these things were perfectly positively correlated. But because they're not, we end up with this other line. So let's talk about where would you want to be on this line and what are these different things. First of all, we could start down here at 100% Slowpoke. Would that be the least risky portfolio we could have? No, what can we do, Jace? Yeah, we can diversify. We can add in some of this risky SuperTech and actually reduce risk. Isn't that a mind-blowing thing that you can sprinkle some risky spice onto your bland food and make it even more bland? I guess if you were British, that might be desirable, right? Okay, so Slowpoke, we are going to keep adding in SuperTech, and then we get to this point called MV. What do you think MV stands for? Minimum variance. And minimum variance, therefore, is also minimum standard deviation. This is the least risky portfolio you can form using SuperTech and Slowpoke. This is the least risky portfolio you can form using SuperTech and Slowpoke. And then, as we add more of the riskier stock in there, we're going to get more return, but that increase is going to be at a decreasing rate. It's going to be at a decreasing rate. So to get that first additional unit of return, I only have to take on a little risk. To get the second additional unit of return, I have to take on a little more risk than I did in that to get the first unit, right? So we've got a diminishing benefit from taking on that additional risk. Okay, then we can get all the way up there at SuperTech, where you've got 100% invested in SuperTech, and that's the riskiest possible portfolio. So let's talk about what drives people's choice to invest along this line. Now, we're going to get to a point here where it's it works differently. So I'm walking you through the developmental history of how we think about these things. So right now, the only thing that would be pushing us along this line would be our risk aversion between MV and SuperTech. Now, let's ask this question. Would you ever want to invest between Slowpoke and MV? No, because I can always put more SuperTech in and get both increased return and reduced risk. It's like having your cake and eating it too. You'd have to be an idiot to invest between Slowpoke and MV. Now, between MV and SuperTech, the thing that's driving us is called risk aversion. If you are psychologically healthy, you prefer to avoid risk. If you're psychologically healthy, you prefer to avoid risk. And why? Because risk can kill you, right? We are evolutionarily trained to try to avoid risk. Is everybody equally averse to risk? No. In fact, let me give you some examples. I am invested in 100% equities. My father is invested in equities, but only those that pay dividends. Which one of those is safer? His is likely safer, right? His returns aren't as good, but his are likely safer. Now, what's driving him to that? It's called risk aversion. Risk aversion, he is more in need of the income from his portfolio than I am because he's older, he depends on it, right? So we generally see that the older you get, the more risk averse you are. Now, let me tell you about my mom. My mom prefers to invest only in certificates of deposits that are federally insured. How does her risk aversion compare to that of my father? Yeah, she's even more risk averse than he is, right? And so she's probably down there making like the risk-free rate. And so there's another thing that we see, and that is women tend to be more risk averse than men. Now, this is just a measured thing. This isn't me being sexist. This is an economic result. Now, and I could prove it to you. When you go out to YouTube and you see videos of people doing stupid, potentially deadly stunts, they are almost always men, right? Does that make sense? Okay. When I was 18, my friends called me up. They're like, hey man, we're gonna go jump out of an airplane. You wanna come? I'm like, how much does it cost? They're like, $300. I'm like, poof, no way. 5 years later, I've got a job making good money. They call me up again. They're like, hey man, we're gonna go jump out of an airplane. I said, are you flipping kidding me? I didn't say flipping. Are you kidding me? You're like, no man. Like, I just finished a degree in engineering. I have a great job. I have a wife that I love, and I've got a freaking mortgage. And this is not the time for me to go jump out of an airplane. What happened to my risk aversion just over that short 5-year period? Yeah, right? The more you've got to lose, right? Okay. So it's going to be risk aversion. It's going to be pushing us along there. My dad might be at the portfolio number 2. I might be at portfolio number 3. My mom would be at MV. Okay, now it turns out that if we take those same assets and we said, well, what if there were different correlations between those two? That line, the curvature of the line gets more and more severe as the correlation gets lower. So for example, it's just a straight line, a correlation of 1. It's a a slightly bowed line with a correlation of 0.5, a correlation of 0, it's got a more severe bend to it. At negative 0.1639, you can see it's even more severely bowed. And then the most amazing result of all, at a correlation of -1, we can get rid of all of the risk. Isn't that amazing? At a correlation of -1, we can get rid of all the risk. So the ideal portfolio pairing would be two things with a correlation of -1, both of which have a positive expected return. So you guys say, wow, I'm going to go out tonight and use my stock screen or my stock trade screener on Schwab, and I'm going to go find two stocks with a correlation of -1 that both have positive expected returns. What do you think the probability is that you'll find? Yeah, 0. 0. If you do find it, please come talk to me. We'll get rich together. I've been making that offer for a long time. How would we get rich? We're going to invest such that we're going to figure out exactly the portfolio weights between those two things that are going to get rid of all the risk, and we're going to go long. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. And this is going to be, it's going to return more than the risk-free rate. Here's the other reason that we know this isn't going to work. We know that getting paid a risk premium is a reward for bearing risk. If this were truly possible, you would be getting paid above the risk-free rate for taking no risk. It's just not possible, but it's fun to think about. And it's also a great test question. What is the best correlation for diversifying your portfolio? The answer is -1. Most common wrong answer, 0. Least common wrong answer, 1. What are you smoking, people? There is no diversification benefit at all with a correlation of 1. -1, you get total diversification benefit, but it's just not that possible. Questions?
Is -1.639 possible?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Is it not very common?
You know, I have not actually played with that. Feel free, though, to go out and try to find the lowest. But here's the trick. I guess with artificial intelligence, it might actually be easier, right? Because artificial intelligence has access to all that data. But the way we would have had to do it in the past is say, I'm going to take this one and this one, take a look at them. Nope. And I would have to keep doing that, right? But maybe with artificial intelligence. But keep in mind that you're going to consume the output of a nuclear reactor trying to figure that out, right?
So it's impossible to find 2 with -1. Is it also impossible to find 1 with -1?
Well, so anything with itself. So correlations always has to be 2. Yeah.
Is a perfect one, like a positive one possible?
Okay, so actually I mentioned this last time about Royal Dutch Shell had 2 stocks trading that both represented the same claims, and not even those are perfectly positively correlated. By the way, folks, perfection in this world is a rare thing to find. You guys know about diamonds? So you can get, of course I'm cheap, right? But I'm buying my wife's engagement ring, and there's like flawless, and there's VSL2, VSL1, I forget. But so these different grades. But it was interesting to see what would happen to the price between flawless and just one notch down. Huge price drop. Why? Because perfection is rare. And in this case, not available.
Good question. Does higher standard deviation mean like a higher risk?
Oh yeah. Higher standard deviation means higher risk. So standard deviation is a measure of what we call total risk. And we're going to say that total risk is composed of 2 kinds of risk, and we'll get to those later in the talk today. So we're not at the end of the story yet.
What's the highest standard deviation can be, or what's the lowest standard deviation?
Okay, so the lowest standard deviation would be 0. And that would be something that always has the same return. And if you notice, the Treasury bill still has a non-zero standard deviation, 3.1%, something like that. Of course, inflation has even higher standard deviation, so probably that what you're seeing in the Treasury bill is due to inflation. If you looked at real returns, which we'll get to in Chapter 5, you might see something closer to a 0 standard deviation.
Yeah, so does the standard deviation mean a consistent return all the time?
Oh no, oh no. Hey, something can be horribly risky and not return for crap. And I'll show you why that is. Once again, you need to wait till later in this lecture.
Okay, sounds good.
What's that?
I will.
Thank you. Okay. So we theoretically -1, but in reality, no. Now, here's the fun thing. Do you remember what I told you about the two assets and how we could make it even safer by sprinkling in a little risky stuff? We've got here not two assets, but two sets of stocks. So you can think of the U.S. portfolio here being the S&P 500. You can think of the foreign, which by the way, to Americans, foreign means everyone other than, right? So, but to people from Ghana, we're foreign, right? Okay, so this is from a very American perspective. Okay, so if you look up at 100% foreign, you might think of that as being like the Morgan Stanley Capital International, large cap, global, ROW, rest of world kind of stuff, right? Okay, now, why do U.S. stocks, why do they have lower risk and return? Well, we know risk and return kind of go together. Why is the U.S. less risky? Number one, the faster growing an economy is, the riskier it is. So growth and risk kind of go together. And we see that with stocks, individual stocks too. Growth and risk kind of go together. Another thing to think about here is political risk. Political risk. So what is political risk? It's the risk that the government is going to make a decision or the courts are going to make a decision that suddenly change the game and hurt you. So, for example, this is probably about 1975, 1976. My dad is invested in a company called Texas International. Texas International was international in precisely one location, Venezuela. Now, Venezuela at the time was one of the richest countries on earth. Big party place. Everybody really loved going to Venezuela. It was swell. Then something happens. You start hearing people say, oh, wait a minute, these rich people are too rich. Now, never mind that everybody else had been lifted up too. It's just that the rich people had been lifted more, so there's a bigger gap now. And people say, well, that's just not right. And so then someone comes in and says, well, wait a minute, I know how to fix that problem. We will take that stuff away from the rich people and we'll just divide it equally out among everybody else. Now, who's that kind of policy popular with? Yeah, the poor people, right? Now, are there more poor people or rich people? Poor people. So everyone's like, yeah, that's a great idea, except for the 7 people that take off to Miami, right? Okay, so, and then what they do is they nationalize the assets of all of the foreign oil companies in Venezuela. What does nationalize mean? Yeah, steal. So they're going to steal it. Oh, but now it belongs to the people, right? By the way, do you think the people are benefiting all that greatly by the? No. Okay, so then here's what happens. These policies, of course, no one is incentivized to do a damn thing, right? Because we're all just going to sit around and wait for a check from the government. And so what happens to the economy of Venezuela? Straight into the toilet. And so then time goes on and the people start to figure this out. They're like, this kind of sucks. And so then bless you, back then they're still allowed to vote, right? So they voted in a guy, much like the new guy in Argentina, who says, hey, we got to get rid of that crap, it's killing us. And sure enough, they bring back capitalism, they bring back individual rights, property rights, and the economy starts to, it's like a breath of fresh air, the flowers are blooming again, the sky's blue, life is better. But then after a while, do you know what starts to happen? The rich people start showing up again. Oh my goodness. And as time goes on, that gap gets wider, wider, wider. And then what happens? It happens again. And so this is like a 20-year cycle in Venezuela. I'm on probably my third one of these cycles with Venezuela. And it was so funny. I was telling this in a class, and I had someone from Argentina, and she busted out laughing. I said, "What's so funny?" She said, "We do this every 10 years. Talk about a short memory, right? Okay, by the way, what's going on in Venezuela today? They've done this thing again where, everybody's going to be happy. We're all going to be equal. The only way to make everybody equal is to make everybody miserable, right? Or poor. Yeah. Okay. They really should explain this kind of stuff to you guys in undergrad, but unfortunately they're not covering that these days. Back to the story. So you've got this political risk. Let's see. You've got institutional risk. So in the United States, if I'm invested in a company and they do something that destroys shareholder value, I can take them to court. And our courts, though they're not perfect, are pretty damn good, right? Now, if I go to China, the conviction rate for a murder charge runs about 98%. Do you think that's because their cops and prosecutors are just really, really good at what they do? No, it's because the courts operate on politics, not on justice. Now, if I go to Mexico, the conviction rate for murder is around 2%. Do you think that's because the cops and prosecutors are really bad at their jobs? No, why is it? Say again? Well, actually, it's even more simple than that. It's corruption. So Mr. Letterman's the judge, and I've been caught murdering a bunch of people. And I go to see Mr. Letterman before the trial. And I'm saying, "Oh, Your Honor, I was so glad to hear that you're going to be the judge because I know that you are a wise and impartial man. I know this is going to go extraordinarily well for both of us. In fact, as a small token of my esteem, here is a gift of a nice Rolex watch." By the way, this is before we figured out they were made in China, right? Did you guys know that? Rolexes are made in China. Okay, so now he gets the watch. And as we're sitting there and they're going through the evidence, he's checking out the time. I'm looking at my Rolex. We're smiling at each other. And then all the evidence comes in and they say, "Yeah, this guy's a bad guy." He says, "Not guilty." It's the best justice you can buy. I have an actual example from my own life. The phone rings one night. It's my dad's cousin, Harry. And he says, "I'm locked up down in Mexico because they found a gun in my truck." Shocker, Harry had a gun in his truck. So he says, "I need you to come bail me out." My dad says, "Call cousin Junior," and hangs up on him. He calls Junior. Junior heads down to Mexico with a bag of money. And he goes to the jail and he takes the bag of money and he trades it for cousin Harry. And Harry, on the way out, asked if he can have his gun back, and they told him no, which is Spanish for no, right? Okay, so now that's real. This happens. Okay, so what am I telling you? If you have one of these shareholder disputes in a country like Venezuela or China, you're probably not going to get justice. And so that's another one of the risks that we see there. Okay, long story short, if you are investing in the United States, yes, that's safe, but your returns might not be as high. Now, remember I told you that only idiots would invest between the safest portfolio and the minimum variance portfolio. The first time I was ever given this talk, I realized that I was an idiot because I was invested 100% in US stock. Right? I could have invested a little bit in foreign stocks and gotten more return and been safer. So that day I went home and I dug around and I decided I was going to invest my portfolio in 80% S&P 500 and 20% Morgan Stanley Capital International, and it rebalances every year on my birthday automatically. This is my retirement funds, and I don't have to worry about it. Okay, now, so I would only invest in that 80% US, 20% foreign portfolio, or driven by risk aversion or lack of risk aversion, I could go all the way out to 100% foreign. Questions? Okay, now so far we have only looked at two-thing portfolios, whether it was two stocks or two ETFs, for lack of a better term. But now let's take a look at what happens when we throw all the assets out there. Now we're going to extend this to many assets. First of all, before we do that, I want to go one step back, and I want to tell you that there's actually a name for that curve that goes between MV and 100% foreign or 100% super tech. It's called the efficient set. It doesn't include that little tail that goes down to the 100% of the safe asset, and that's because you can always do better. So it's not efficient to invest there, but the efficient set starts at minimum variance and goes out to the risky asset. Now, when we throw this thing out to all risky assets, we end up with something that looks like this. And that blue area represents all possible portfolios that can be formed from the risky assets that are available for purchase. In fact, all of them that are available for purchase. So we could have a portfolio W. It's entirely possible to form that portfolio, but would we want to? No, why not, Jace? We're either taking on more risk for less return, or we are not getting we're not getting all the return that we could for that level of risk. Two ways to look at it. So I could either go straight up from portfolio W to portfolio R, or I could go straight left and get the same return, but for less risk. So anything in the blue field is not efficient. Anything in the blue field is not efficient. So where would I invest in this world? I would invest on that line that goes MVRX. I don't know what color to call that other than baby poop, but that baby poop colored line, bless you. You guys probably haven't been around enough babies to know, but that's the color of their poop. So that line, that's the only place here I would invest. In fact, we call that the efficient frontier. So in this world of all these different risky assets, I'm still constrained to just basically a single line where I would be willing to invest. And what's going to push me along that line? Yeah, risk aversion. The less risk averse I am, the further up I'm going to go. And so that is, we would not want to invest in portfolio 1, 2, 3, or W. We would always want to be on that efficient set. Okay, so that gets us up to about 1964. In I think it's about 64, we come up with the final piece for this capital asset pricing model, and that is someone makes the brilliant discovery that not only do we have the possibility of investing in risky assets, we also have the possibility of investing in the risk-free asset, which we said we're going to consider to be the 3-month U.S. Treasury bill. And so now I've got expected return, once again, on the vertical. I've got standard deviation on the horizontal. And I want you to notice that here at 0 standard deviation, we're going to put that risk-free asset. So that's going to be our new least risky asset. And it's going to be over here on the vertical axis. And that return is going to be the risk-free rate. And now all we want to do is we want to take that line that starts there at that point, and we're going to bring it down until it is exactly tangent to that efficient frontier, till it's exactly tangent. By the way, what does tangent mean? Tangent, what's it mean? How about touching at only one point? Touching at only one point. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this down. Now, why in the world am I doing that? Keep in mind that the slope of this line is its risk. It's a change in return over change in risk. And so what we want to do is have that line be as steep as it possibly can. And so the steepest that line can be and still touch that field of risky assets is where it touches at exactly one point. And that point has a very special name. That point, it's labeled A here. That point is called the market portfolio. That point is called the market portfolio. Now let's talk about what the market portfolio is. The market portfolio is, are you guys ready to start writing? Every risky asset known to man. Every risky asset known to man. Every risky asset known to man. Held in proportion. Held in proportion. Held in proportion to its importance, to its importance, to its importance in the world economy, in the world economy, in the world economy. So it's every risky asset known to man held in proportion to its importance in the world economy. So what does that mean? Let's think about Apple. How important is Apple to the world economy? Much more important, I'm gonna pick on one of our people here, O'Reilly. How important is Apple versus O'Reilly? It's more important, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the market value weighting of these companies. So the bigger the company is, the more it is represented in the market portfolio. Now, it's easy to think of stocks and to understand about market capitalization, but are bonds also risky assets? Yeah, remember we've got default risk and we've got interest rate risk. So even though they're safer than stocks, they're still risky assets. So they're going to be in here too. Now, what about real estate? Is real estate a risky asset? Yeah. Okay, so when I first started giving this talk in 2006, my students said, wait a minute, real estate prices always go up. I was like, no, they don't. They're like, no, trust me, they always go up. Then we had the great housing crisis problem. I lost $39,000 selling a house. Risky asset? Yeah. And then I'm giving this talk in like 2009, and the students are all like, real estate always goes down. Like, no, it's just volatile, right? We can't predict. If we could get even richer. Okay. So here's the problem. My wife and I own our house. It's a risky asset. In theory, it should be represented in the market portfolio. Does that make sense? Now, it's going to be a tiny amount because it's so small. However, it should be represented there. But there are two problems. So number one, can anyone else invest in our house? Nope, it's just me and the wife, right? And the other thing is, do we have a fresh value for that house? So do we know what it's truly worth? Now, I paid $354,500 for that house in 2007. Now, 6 months later, it was worth 350,000 or 325,000 because things just kept taking a dump, right? What's it worth today? You say, well, wait a minute. What about Zillow? You guys use Zillow? Yeah, you made the appropriate noise, which is a snort. You say, well, what about Zillow? I'm like, okay, let's look it up at Zillow. Let's look it up on Redfin. And let's see if the numbers agree. Will they? No. And someone else says, well, what about the appraised value or the assessed value from the county? Are you kidding? That's even worse. And so we don't have a value for it. It's not something you can invest in. So we're starting to see that this idea of the market portfolio isn't something that you could replicate. However, we say you can use something as a stand-in, as a substitute, as a proxy. So what we usually use in the United States is the S&P 500. Now let's talk about the difference between the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The S&P 500 has how many stocks? 500, very good. Dow Jones, how many? 30. It's 30, last I checked. It's always been 30, right? Okay, now, here's the other thing you need to know. So first of all, we already know the S&P 500 is going to be a better thing because it's got 500 versus 30. The second thing is this. The S&P 500 is value weighted, which means that those things are held in proportion to their importance in the world economy, as opposed to the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is price weighted. So how did they originally come up with the Dow Jones Industrial Average? They just added the top 30 stocks prices together, and that was it. So you could have a stock that was trading at $5 a share and suddenly went up to $15 a share. That's a 200% increase, but it's really not going to move the Dow all that much because Dow Chemical was up here already trading at a stock price of 200, and it went up $1. So it's actually got more weight in the whole overall thing. Well, anyway, long story short, the Dow Jones is price weighted and it only has 30, so we'd rather use the S&P 500. So that's kind of what we've settled on. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than nothing? Yes. And so that's where we're at. And until someone comes up with something better, it's what we'll use. By the way, the capital asset pricing model, is it perfect? No. Why do we use it? No one's come up with anything that is consistently better. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about this. This opens up a whole new world to us because now we can invest anywhere along that line from the risk-free asset all the way through portfolio A and on out along a line called the capital market line. That line is called the capital market line. And so here's what I want you to see though. Remember earlier when we were investing along the efficient frontier that we had to face diminishing additional return as we took on additional risk? Now that slope is constant. All the portfolios that we can form are on that straight line with a constant slope. So that means if I take on an additional unit of risk, I get the same additional return regardless of where I am on the line. So that's a magnificent breakthrough. The other thing that goes on here is that now we start to see, well, let's just walk through it this way. If you look at portfolio 4, that's obviously a mixture of the risk-free asset and portfolio A. If we look at point A, it is 100% portfolio A, 0% risk-free asset. But what if we get out to portfolio 5? How is portfolio 5 even possible?
Borrowing against the
Yeah. Oh, he's right. So keep in mind that when you're investing in the risk-free asset, you are essentially loaning money out at the risk-free rate. If I could turn around and borrow money at the risk-free rate, now I could have 120% portfolio A, negative 20% the risk-free asset. By the way, what's negative 20% plus 120%? 100%. Have we violated any laws? No, we're good to go. Now you say, wait a minute, the United States government can borrow at the risk-free rate. I understand why that is, But why would anyone loan money to me at the risk-free rate? And the answer is found with your stockbroker. They have what are called margin accounts. And the margin account says basically you can borrow, I think the number is 50%. So you could have, if I've got 100,000 in there, I can borrow $50,000 from the stock brokerage. Now, what is the collateral for that $50,000 loan? Yeah, this 100,000 that I already had in there. Okay, now let's watch what happens as stock prices start to go down. The value of that loan is still 50,000, right? What's left of your portfolio starts to shrink. What does the broker do then? Yeah, they put out what's called a margin call. And in the old days, it was exactly that. Your phone would ring and they would say, "Hey, Nick, your portfolio's down." Nick says, "Yeah, bummer, I saw that." Like, well, we're going to have to, this is a margin call. You need to either A, pony up more money, or what can they do? Say again? Yeah, they can liquidate enough assets to get you back into the right ranges. And so as long as stocks don't drop to zero immediately, they can almost always get out in front of it and liquidate your shares to pay off the loans as necessary. And so the risk to them is damn near zero. And as a result, you can borrow at very nearly the risk-free rate. And so that's why we say that this is possible. Now, what does this mean? It means that we have, I'm going to pick on Jace. He has tattoos. Jace, I'm guessing you are not as risk averse as other people. Yeah, he's not as risk averse as other people. So, by the way, can you guess how many tattoos I have? Zero. Very good. Okay, so where would Jace be on that line? Just pick one of those portfolios. Probably 5. Where am I at? And currently in my life, I am at, no, I'm not at 4, I'm actually at A. Now, if I were following my own teachings, I would be at 4 because I'm getting closer to retirement, right? So I need to start backing myself down that line. But you know, it gets addictive. I like having money, right? By the way, what's the return on the S&P 500 been over the last few years? Unfreaking believable, right? Do you know how long I'll be in there? You're like, yeah. And then it's, well, anyway, long story short. And you see this all the time. Finance professors should know better, but we go into retirement pretty much at 100% equity. But we also get a pension, so that's cool. So let's see. What about people like my mom? Where would my mom be on this line? All the way down there at the risk-free asset. She would have 100% risk-free asset and none of the market portfolio at all. And so this is what we call, I think they call it the separation principle, that now we can separate what assets you're going to purchase from your risk aversion. All that we have to decide now is how much of the risk-free asset and how much of the market portfolio. We're just going to change those weightings back and forth. So earlier, we would have to have different portfolios as we were going along that line. Well, that one portfolio of risky assets now is the only one we're interested in. By the way, do you think it's easier to just go out and buy the S&P 500 or to try to pick some sort of portfolio out of like a bunch of stocks? Yeah, it's so much easier to do the S&P 500. And also, what do you think it does to your ability to sleep? Oh yeah, I sleep like a baby. Right? Because I'm invested in 500 stocks. What are the chances that all of them are going to take a dump on the same day? Right? Okay, questions? By the way, line 1 here, that's just a less efficient line, right? Because every portfolio on that line, I could move up and get more return, or I could move left and get less risk. So what do? We just crank. until that line matches line 1, and then that's the most efficient. Questions? Okay, let's talk about what moves stock prices. If nothing ever changed, if there were no news at all, what we would expect is for stocks to increase by the expected daily return every day. I mean, that would be it. But that's not the world we live in. We have news constantly arriving. Now, some of that news is expected news. Other pieces of news are unexpected. So let me give you an example. Companies announce their earnings. And people like Yarrow sit out there and they say, I think they're going to earn $1.27 this quarter. And a bunch of other Yarrows do the same thing, and they average it, and they come up with $1.25 as the consensus estimate. Now, if the company reports that they earned $1.30, there's it goes up because there's $1.25 of expected earnings. By the way, we already knew that. It doesn't change the price any. What does change the price? That positive 5 cents that we didn't expect. Whoop! Now, what if it comes in at $1.20? What happens to the stock price? Goes down. Now, we were expecting $1.25. We had negative 0.05 reported unexpected earnings. And so now, stock price is going to go down. Okay, so that's what we mean by news making stock prices move.
Sometimes that isn't true though, right? Like why? Because I bought stuff before and then it went above their earnings and I lost money.
Yeah, okay, so there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the consensus earning of the Yarrows may not match the consensus earnings of the market. Number two, I hate it when they do this as a researcher. I want clean announcements. I want an announcement that goes like this. We made $1.25 earnings per share. Boop! But what do they do instead? They're like, oh yeah, $1.25 earnings per share, plus we're being sued by blah, 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 plus we just hired this moron to be our marketing person, So they throw in all this other crap. And so we have a lot of noise in these announcements. And so, yeah, man, I wish companies, it should be a law. You people can only announce one thing at a time. Because every time, so for instance, when they announce a woman CEO, by the way, this is once again just empirical stuff, not me, right? When are companies most likely to announce a female CEO? No. We know that's not true because we've got some. It's actually this phenomenon is referred to as the glass cliff. Why? They get to a point where they know that the company's in such bad shape that no matter what move they make, it's going into the dumper, right? And so what can the board do to make themselves feel good and to look good to the public? Well, that's where we're headed, but that's not the original intention. Well, we should bring in a woman CEO. And by the way, there is evidence that bringing in a woman CEO with a fresh perspective does bring benefits. But the problem is they're typically brought in too late. That train's already headed off the cliff, right? And so now, do you think the market's figured that out? And so when a company announces a female CEO, what do you think typically happens to the stock price? It drops. Is it because the woman's bad for the job? Absolutely not. It's because it's the board announcing that they're just giving up. Do you see what I mean? These things are noisy and you can't tell what's going on. And I am sure I will catch hell in the YouTube comments from someone telling me, and I'm like, look at the peer-reviewed research. That's where I get my stuff, not Instagram. Questions? Yeah, you got to be careful for those dirty announcements. Oh, and another one will be, and we're spinning off the nuclear waste division. Well, when they announce they're spinning off the nuclear waste division, that makes the rest of the company safer. And so the required return goes down. What happens to the stock price?
Do you know any women CEO for the big companies?
Do I personally know any? No. Have I through history seen them? Yes. Are they any worse than the men CEOs? Absolutely not. The problem comes with the timing of when they put them in. It's kind of sad. Now, knowing this, ladies, if someone comes to you and offers you a CEO job, and you're like, and the next thought in your mind was, I'm really surprised they asked me to be CEO because I don't quite feel qualified, which would be damn near everybody in this room, right? I'm not qualified. What is your next thought should be? What's that?
Trying to trick you?
Yeah, that I'm being set up for failure. Now, does that mean you instantly say no? No, what you do is negotiate what's called a golden parachute, right? If the company sells or goes out of business or whatever, you get $20 million, right? It's like I've said here at the university for years. For a long, long time, we had basically a loser football team. And they're paying the head coach something like $1 million a year. I'm like, hell, I'll lose for $500,000, right? Does that make sense? If you ever any of you get the call about being CEO, give me a call, let's talk it through. And then we'll talk about, the answer is always yes. It's negotiating that parachute. That's where the money's at. Okay, so it's only the unexpected portion of the news that moves stock prices. Questions? So let's talk about the two kinds of risk. There are systematic risk. These are risks that influence a large number of assets, also called market risk. Let's talk about some things that move large numbers of assets. War has been declared between two countries that we've actually heard of. By the way, how many wars are going on right now? Dozens, right? But a lot of them don't move the needle, but when Russia invades Ukraine, does that impact stock prices? Yeah. And does it impact them all in the same way? No. You've got sunflower seed oil companies, stocks go down. Why? Because Ukraine is the world's largest producer of sunflower seed oil. But what happens to defense companies? Whoop, right? So that's going to be systematic, something that impacts everything. Now let's get to more macroeconomic. What about the price of oil? The price of oil goes up. Does that impact most assets? Yeah, because almost everything that we use here is moved with oil or made from oil. And so who does better when oil prices go up? Oil companies, countries that are dependent on oil for their revenue. Who does worse? Oil consumers. And I guess that's about it. So long story short, everything gets hit by that kind of thing. So that's systematic. What about the Federal Reserve of the United States? They make a decision to raise interest rates. Is that something that affects everything? Yeah, the United States dollar, for better or for worse, is the reserve currency of the world. And so whatever the Federal Reserve does with their magic knobs, that impacts everything. Then there are things that are called unsystematic risk. These are things that are only going to impact one or a few assets. And so I'm going to give you an example here. In Springfield, we have a beer distributor called Will Fisher. And if you're from St. Louis, you know about their fine Budweiser products and whatnot. So that's what they distribute. Now, let's assume, and we won't hope for this, but let's assume that there is a sinkhole opens up under Will Fisher. Do you guys know what sinkhole is? Yeah, so it's limestone under this whole area. And eventually the water washes it out, and then boop, the ground collapses and whatever's on top of it goes away. Okay, so a sinkhole swallows Will Fisher. What does that do to the value of Will Fisher? The company, not the guy. Yeah, straight in the toilet, right? But do you think what's going to happen to the values of the other beer distributors around the area? Yeah, and here's why. They're going to go up because they're going to move in to fill this beer vacuum. Samuel, you don't have to worry. They're not going to let you go thirsty, right? They're going to bring in additional Budweiser so you can keep drinking beer, right? So even though Will Fisher has taken a total dump, everybody else is up. If I owned all those stocks, I would be in roughly the same position as I was before the sinkhole opened up. As a result, we call that an unsystematic risk. It's something I can diversify away simply by holding the stocks of all the beer distributorships. We call these unique or asset-specific risk. You may also hear it called firm-specific risk. So you could have one automotive supplier out of 20 that has an explosion at their factory or a fire, which has actually happened here recently. Overall, is that going to hurt everybody? No, because the other people are going to pick it up. If you're holding a diversified portfolio, you are perfectly fine. We can diversify away systematic risk, but we cannot diversify away, we can diversify away unsystematic risk, but we cannot diversify away systematic risk. And so you may, something to remember, systematic is undiversifiable, unsystematic is diversifiable. So the uns are always, if one of them is the other one isn't. And so that's something to remember for the exam. So let's take a look here what happens when we add stocks to our portfolio. This was what's called a Monte Carlo simulation, which is a fancy way of saying we've trained a computer to do a trick and we ask it to do it 10,000 times. And the first trick we ask this computer to do is pull out a stock one at a time and measure its standard deviation, then throw it back in the pool. And it's going to do that 9,999 more times, and it's going to tell us the average standard deviation for all those stocks it pulled out. And that average standard deviation is going to be 49.24%. And now we're going to say, okay, computer, we want you to pull 2 stocks out at a time, and we want you to form a portfolio that's 1/2 of one stock and 1/2 of the other stock, and tell us what the standard deviation would be. And it turns out that standard deviation is 37.36%. If I take that 37.36% and divide it by the original 49.24%, I am now at 76% of the original total risk. Just by adding one stock to my portfolio, I've managed to dump 24% of the risk. That sounds pretty cool. What if we go from 2 to 4? So we doubled the first time, now we're doubling again. It takes us from 76% of the total risk down to 60%. So we're still gaining ground, we're still getting rid of risk, but what's happened? The first doubling got rid of 24%. The next doubling only got rid of 16%. And then, forget 6, let's go from 4 to 8. When I go from 4 to 8, I go from 60% down to 51%. I've dropped another 9%, which is less than 16%, which is less than 24%. And so what we say is that the risk here is decreasing, but at a diminishing rate. And eventually, it becomes what we call asymptotic, which is a fancy word for meaning it gets really close to a line but never really touches it. Now, I want you to look at these percentages out here on the right-hand side and tell me how many stocks does it take for you to have a well-diversified portfolio? Yeah, about 200. And then, now keep in mind, look, the standard deviation keeps going down, but it's just so small that we're not able to catch it with a 2-digit fraction like that, right? So there's always going to be additional benefit from adding non-correlated things to your portfolio, but that gets smaller, smaller, smaller. So remember, I've told you I have probably 3,000 stocks. Am I well diversified? So I was talking to my dad. I said, Dad, how many stocks do you have in your portfolio? He said, oh, I've got a lot. I said, what do you have? He says, 12. So he's taken somewhere around 49% of the total risk. I'm taking something less than 39% of the total risk. So, and he says, but it's okay. I said, why is it okay? He says, because they're all utilities. Does that make it better or worse? It makes it worse because utilities are more likely to be correlated with each other, right? Because if the price of coal goes up, right? We still burn coal to make electricity, by the way. Your Tesla is dirty. Okay. So this is where we're going to start next time.